You're listening to the 40 Fit Radio podcast, dedicated to the 40-plus community. Join us as we discuss the truth about fitness and health using science, reason, and the experiences of our host and content experts. Welcome to the 40 Fit Nation. Hey, welcome back to 40 Fit Radio and welcome back to the 40 Fit Nation. I'm here with my co-host, Coach Trent.
Oh, wait,
SSC,
they can't see
Coach
what I'm
Trent.
doing.
Yeah, he's raising his arms as if the roar of the crowd is behind him, but there is no crowd. And there is no roar.
In my mind, there's roaring crowds.
It's all that matters, you know. I've always,
didn't you say that in the last episode that it's an inside job, right?
Yes. Self-image is an inside job.
Yeah, so if the crowds are roaring for me inside, then
it's all that matters.
That's all that matters, right? Okay,
well,
cool.
it makes you happy. If it makes you happy.
I want you to be happy, man.
Trent, I want you to be happy. If you hear some noise in the background, and that's our gym because we got a lifter lifting. And if you also hear my voice being a little gravelly, it's because we have the ever constant seasonal changes here in Texas from 80-degree days to 45-degree days within 24 hours.
Yeah, and all the leaves. So in Texas, fall is quite literal. The leaves just turn brown and die, and they fall off. Like there's they're yellow for about 12 hours.
Yeah, it doesn't last very long.
And so now we got all this dead leaf matter floating everywhere and stuffing up our sinuses.
Whoa.
Whoa.
Nugget, first principle.
But that's not what we're talking about at all.
No.
Well, I guess we kind of are, right?
Yeah,
so we're going to talk about sustainability of the body, right? So we've said it on this podcast many times, but we haven't actually done an episode with this title, Motion is Lotion. It's kind of like a call sign. We need to have some T-shirts, by the way, on the 40 Fit store, which doesn't exist
Copyright
yet.
40 Fit. Motion is Lotion.
Yeah,
Copyright
TM.
Motion is Lotion.
TM.
Oh, trademark.
Yeah, so we don't have a 40 Fit store yet, but it's going to happen, and we need some T-shirts to say Motion is Lotion.
We're slackers.
Yeah.
We're so slackers.
Well,
we just like to talk about this stuff and actually do it.
Guys, we do all this for free, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
It actually
No one's paying us
costs money and time to do this.
Yeah,
we put all this information
every
out for
month.
free.
I know, every month.
So, we're going to release some T-shirts at some point, and you need to buy them and support us because where else can you get this quality of information for free? From
two very nice-looking, robust, masculine males.
Yeah. I'm not a doctor,
speechless.
but I did train at Wichita Falls Athletic Club.
Yes. Well, you are an SSC now, starting strength coach, which is a huge deal. It's a big deal. Big deal. So now our podcast is full of SSCs and experts of everything, all goings-ons when we're talking about strength and conditioning. So, or at least in our minds, at least.
In our minds. That's what really counts.
Yeah.
So, Motion is Lotion. You wanted to do an episode about exploring this concept of motion is lotion a little bit further.
Yeah.
I think early, in the first, 100 episodes of our podcast, we've talked about how moving and especially loading our tissues is very important for their health, right? It's not enough to simply walk around the block. We actually have to put load on our tissues. That means on our bones, on our muscles, on our tendons and ligaments to make them healthy, right? The stress is what causes them it forces them to adapt to that stress of the load and causes them to, if you're eating the proper nutrients, to build and make themselves stronger, thicker, more flexible, all this kind of stuff. But over the past few episodes, we've also talked about the other end of the spectrum, and that's that just loading alone, especially heavy loading,
constantly,
is actually can be detrimental to this tissue health.
Sure.
And we want to explore some of the reasons why, and then talk about, how do you long term make your joints healthy? Right. How do you take motion as lotion and then keep it lotion and not something else? Destroy
them. Yeah. So one thing that I notice with older people over the age of 40, and that's just a general age I'm just representation there. I mean, it could be any age. It could be anybody who's had a lot of training time. So there's chronological age and then there's biological age. I've met 40-year-olds that look like they're 80, and I've met 80-year-olds that look like they're near 40. So, so a lot of it is your genetics, your lifestyle habits, your activity level, your historical training, all those things, your diet, all those things play a role in regards to your joint health. I think the thing that probably plays a role the most to start with would be your genetics.
Yeah.
Your genetics play the greatest role on your base foundation joint health. But I would like to talk about a couple different principles that are biological principles before we get into talking about the actual the practicality, the practical things that I do with our clients and I do with my patients and myself to improve joint health or to facilitate a higher quality level of joint health. Number one, here's a biological principle. Number one, joints need loading. The data is fairly clear now that articular cartilage, which is the cartilage inside your joint that you weight bear on, there's hyaline and articular cartilage. Both types of those cartilage that are in your joints require loading so that the cartilage and the surrounding lining of your joint, which is called the synovial lining, produces the lubricating fluid of the joint, kind of an oil that's in joints, and it's called synovial fluid. To be able to produce an adequate level of fluid that has the right viscosity and the right thickness and adhesion level and everything, or lack of too much adhesion level, too sticky, you have to load human joints. Now, walking and standing and all those things are considered loading, but loading with external loads helps to improve the production of synovial fluid and also human joint tissue, articular cartilage, and the disc of your spine and other structures that are what we would call human spacers, surfacing elements. Those elements need loading to maintain their health. That's how fluid gets sucked into the tissue and fluid gets pushed out. And there has to be that loading, unload cycle to be able to allow those tissues to maintain good quality health. Yeah. Now, the other thing that's important to realize, so that's the first thing, loaded. The other thing that's important to realize here is that synovial fluid, like we've talked about in previous episodes, actually increases its viscosity and thickness when you load it.
Yeah.
Which is
super
opposite of most normal Newtonian physics. When you study fluid dynamics tells us that the more you load a fluid, you put pressure on a fluid between two surfaces, the more it wants to break down.
Yeah.
Well, just the opposite happens with the human body. The actual synovial fluid actually wants to thicken and get more viscous, which is good for joint gliding and sliding and joint lubrication. Because as we all know, lubrication is everything.
Yeah.
So we want to keep those joints nice and fluid. And so loading is very important to do that. That's the first biological principle. The second principle is you only get what you got, meaning you don't grow new cartilage. We don't yet, at least. I am treating patients now in our practices, which they're harvesting their cartilage cells from one part of the joint that's not as important, where there's very little loading, and they're growing it in a petri dish, basically, and then reinserting it as a cartilage transfer or transplant. And so we are seeing some of those surgeries being done, and the results clinically in our clinic have actually been very good.
Yeah.
So I think that that's going to become probably in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. I believe that cartilage transplants will probably be more common for weight-bearing, load-bearing joints, like the knees and the hips and maybe even eventually ankles and things like that. So that's the second thing, is that you only get what you got. So once you use that cartilage up, you're done. And then they can try one of these other procedures, or eventually if you have bone on bone, which is where the pain comes from anyway, is bone on bone, or when there's bone exposed, or when there's the what we call the subchondral bone nerve endings are exposed, because there's very little blood flow and nervous information or nervous innervation coming out of the cartilage.
Yeah.
So that tissue, it exists there, and it has some blood flow and some nervous innervation, but nerve innervation, but mostly it's the subchondral bone that causes the pain. It's the subchondral tissue that causes the pain.
Yeah, and this is fairly unique in the body because most of the other tissues we talk about in a joint, the bone, the tendons, the ligaments,
connective tissue.
Those can be grown, right? You can increase the amount, or you can at least increase the robustness of them, right?
Yeah,
like
the density, like bone, you can
bones
increase
become more dense.
Yes,
the trabecular can become more stronger.
Yeah, you can thicken the trabecular wall, and you can with tendons you can thicken tendons. Mm-hmm. Ligaments kind of are what they are. They don't grow necessarily, but they don't hypertrophy like tendons and muscles do and bone does.
Sure. Yeah.
But yes, you can. And all those tissues are much more vascular.
Yeah.
The more blood flow you have to a tissue and the more nerve innervation you have to a tissue, the more it's likely to repair itself and grow. The less likely is to repair itself and grow. Thus, a good example would be ligaments have very little nervous innervation and very little blood flow. They don't heal as well. They scar more. Cartilage, same thing. So we could go down a list of different tissues. So.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the one thing to underline your point here that you got to take care of, because otherwise you're looking at a joint replacement today,
right?
maybe tomorrow,
right?
Cartilage,
right. And the last principle I want to discuss is what we call cartilage atrophy or connective tissue atrophy. And that basically is this principle. It's a biological principle that says if you do not load it, you will lose it. And so it doesn't mean you're going to lose all of it, but we've done studies to show that when individuals load their cartilage, or they have a higher activity level, they actually have a thicker cartilage base. They have more cartilage to be used than someone who doesn't do anything. And actually the cartilage can atrophy. It can actually get thinner. And when you have thinner cartilage, you have less margin for error, less shock absorbance in the joint, and less protection of the subchondral bone and the surrounding tissues. And so loading the cartilage is good for the joints because it helps to produce a thickening of the articular cartilage. Now, in hyaline cartilage. Now, here's an important flip side to that, okay? Because there's always a good with bad with a good sometimes. When people hear this, they think, oh, man, load them up then, man. I mean, heavy squats all day long, man. All right, there's always a balance here. There's always a balance in how much loading and how much stress and force and friction and shear loads that you produce on your joints. And so, if a little's good, a lot's not necessarily better. And so it is a balance, and it is in moderation, and that's what we try to teach, and that's what we try to do with our clients, is recognize that, yes, as we age, our joints get a little achy sometimes, especially if you have any training history at all. Yeah. If you don't have a training history at all, and you've been fairly active, but you've never really used your body much, then you're in some ways kind of fortunate in the sense that there's a lot of upside potential for someone who's never really lifted much to start lifting in their 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
They hit PRs and they get stronger, and their joints are sometimes relatively healthy. But like an old athlete or someone who's really got out there and got after it, I mean, they're a little beat up. Yeah, they have a higher fitness level, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily healthier. And that's something we've talked about too, that balance between fitness and health and wellness and sickness, that continuum that we talked about in prior podcast.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Just an example that just popped into my head because it's football season right now is, how many running backs, especially the game is a little bit different today because there's a lot more passing that happens today, but how many running backs can you think of in their careers that would have a career season and they have the most yards ever, and the next year they get a record number of carries.
Right.
They have a career season on 400 carries.
Right.
In one season, and then the next season they get 500 carries.
Right.
And then they're done. It's like after that, that's over.
Yeah.
And can you imagine the pounding that those guys take? And we're talking about somebody in that case who is it's not aging that's done it.
No.
Their fitness level is crazy high. Super strong.
It's not their chronological age; it's their biological
age. So that would be an extreme example. But those guys are just an enormous amount of pounding that they take, and you can see the effects it has on them.
Well, humans are no different than animals in that regard. And I'll give you a parallel here. Some of you guys don't know a whole lot about horse work or anything, but there's a thing called working cow horse, and it's competition where you basically take a horse, and there's an association called the NRCHA. There's another association called RHAA. There's SHOT, Stock Horse of Texas, and there's all these different associations where you can show the horse's ability to work stock, to work cows, basically. And so there's a lot of sliding stops where they slide back on their hocks and on their flanks on their hip. And then there's a lot of turns, and there's quick run down the wall. And then you cut the calf back or cut the cow back and turn around and drive the cow down to the other end. And then there's roping them. And so there's all these different things. But that horse is an athlete. That horse is used more consistently doing the same things over and over and over than maybe a horse that's just a pleasure horse, okay? Or a horse that's even just a general ranch horse, because this horse has to go to competitions on a very regular basis. Well, those horses have some common problems and some common joint issues, and they're things you look for when you go to buy a horse that's been used, that's been started as a 2-year-old or as a 3-year-old or however old they are. You look for certain problems in those horses. It's no different from humans.
Yeah.
When you take professional athletes, they have some common problems that exist. And it's because of their sport, their chosen sport. And they use up their joint health many times.
Yeah.
And so those are the 3 principles there that we just mentioned that are important biological principles for you to know, to be able to understand how joint health works as we know it right now. And so now we're going to talk about some practical ways that you can improve your joint health and help to sustain a good quality joint health for lifting and for just your general quality of life. Squatting down, the other day I had to squat down and pick up some wood to put on a wood pile. So that's basically just functional movement. So we want to have good knee health and good back health and hip health to be able to do those kinds of things. A big point of interest here that you need to understand is this. Connective tissue, muscles, tendons, ligaments, generally do really well long term. You can function with relatively good health with those tissues. Yes, you get a little tendonitis here and there as you age and overuse or lift wrong or whatever. What is really the rate limiting tissue is your connective tissue in the joints, your joint tissue.
Yeah.
99.9% of the lifters that I treat or the people that I treat in my practice that are over 40, they will either have a tendonitis, so that's one of the things, or they'll have joints that have just gotten junky.
Yeah.
The joints that have just been worn out. They got a cartilage tear, they got bone on bone in some area, they've had heavy shear loads, or they've actually injured the joint doing something, the cartilage is all torn up. And those are harder to treat because we can't just rehab that cartilage back necessarily. Now, loading and lifting helps that cartilage health to improve, but only so much. And so the idea that, I've heard strength coaches say, you give me any bad knee, man, I'll make it healthier. And I don't buy that. That's a great way to sell a program, but that doesn't necessarily work. I know lots of lifters and I know lots of people that lift weights that have consistent joint discomfort and pain.
Yeah.
But they still lift weights and they still maintain their strength because they've learned how to manage the pain. Right. But their joint health is not really going to get any better until something else comes along that can improve that joint health. And there are some things like, and we can talk about this in a separate episode, but there are some things like, injecting the joint with hyaluronic acid, which there's a company called Synvisc that produces a joint lubricant that the doctor can go in and do a series of 2 to 3 injections to help with the natural joint lubrication of your joint.
Yeah.
Because as your cartilage gets worn, you produce less lubrication too. So the rate limiting step is usually always joint health and sometimes connective tissue or tendon health that limits a person's ability to be able to lift and to be able to perform activities in daily living. So let's talk about some of the things we do, okay? Here are some of the things we recommend. Number 1, have a diet that's low in inflammatory agents.
Yeah.
And that's kind of hard because it can get kind of complicated. But here is the general concept. Stay away from processed foods.
Right. We talked about this at great length with Robert Santana on the last episode that we did with him. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but if you go back in our history.
Was that the one on going out to eat and restaurants? And...
it was after that. We talked to him about it was immune system health. That's what it was. So if you look up the, how to improve your immune system.
Sure.
Then we talked a lot about which foods are pro-inflammatory,
right.
Which foods are anti-inflammatory. And if you wanted to sum it up, in general, if you eat whole foods that are not processed, then you're going to do well from an inflammation standpoint.
Yes. And then also when you're eating meats, you want to stay away from what we would call your processed meats. and your processed meats would be things like sausages and meats that are come in packages, and they're a compilation of many different meat products.
Right?
Some of your deli meats that are pressed together, and so some of those meats. But if you're eating good quality, free range beef, or even beef that's been finished, that's been finished, but it's just a good quality beef producer, then that's fine. You want to balance your red meat intake with other white meats and other fish meats,
right?
To balance your intake to ensure that you're getting the right balance of arachidonic acids and other protein sources.
Yeah.
But red meats have a higher arachidonic acid level than other types of meats do. So
this is something that I've kind of started to notice over the last year, in some diet camps out there on the interwebs. They talk about how, man, it's really all just calories in, calories out. If you're just not eating, and if you're not eating in excess of calories, you're not going to gain weight. And if you eat a deficit of calories, you're going to lose weight. Well, that's true. That is true. But it does matter what you eat. And I notice now, and I didn't notice this in my early 20s, that if I go out and eat fast food like 2 days in a row, or like, let's say I have like Brahms burgers on Friday night, and then Saturday night I have a big pizza, I just don't feel good on Sunday.
Yeah, sure.
And I think some of that is just the inflammatory response from that. It kind of cascades from day to day, and it really impacts my training.
Yeah,
I notice it.
Yeah, and I think a diet that's full of nothing but meat is not good. You need a balance. Again, you need a balance. Meats are good for your body. We're meat eaters, but so you want to ensure that your diet is low in inflammatory agents and high in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory agents. And you can go back to a prior podcast and look at some of those foods. You can go online and just a great source is Mark's Daily Apple is a great source. He's a great guy. Mark Sassone. He's had a website for years, and he goes over just some anti-inflammatory foods. He talks about it in his book called The Primal Blueprint too, which just talks about whole foods and being a meat eater and eating high vegetation and those types of things.
Yeah.
So number one, a solid diet. And that also means good water intake along with that solid diet. So make sure that you get plenty of ounces of water on a daily basis. I generally tell people number of ounces, about half your body weight in pounds, number of ounces. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you want about 100 ounces of water per day. And that's a good amount of water. That's a lot of water.
Yeah. That's about 10 full glasses of water.
Yeah.
Rough.
And you don't have to drink that much, but being I'm the worst at it, man. I'll drink 24 ounces of coffee in the morning, and I'm a decaf drinker now. I've stopped drinking.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know, and I hate it. I hate it that I've had to do that, but I've been wanting to manage my blood pressure in a holistic level. So my family has a little bit of familial hypertension, so I'm working on lowering my blood pressure, and one of the ways was to cut out caffeine and reduce my sodium intake a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so I've been doing that, and it has helped. It's dropped my blood pressure about 12 to 15 points on the top side and about 5 to 10 points on the bottom side. So it's good. It's good. It's just something I had to do. So, but caffeine is a natural diuretic, so it has a tendency to dry you out.
Yeah, cause you to pee out more water than you have intake with the
exactly.
With the coffee.
So you want good water consumption, and you want a good healthy diet. That's rule number one. Rule number two.
What about, since this is the holiday season that we're getting into, in a couple days here, it's going to be Thanksgiving. What about alcohol?
Well, yeah,
Are you telling me that my bourbon is a problem?
No, not in moderation. And wine the same, and beer the same. Now, I think beer again is something that's highly processed and has a bunch of different things other than just beer in it. I mean, when you look at it on the ingredients of beer, it doesn't say beer, and it doesn't just say hops, or it doesn't just say corn, or whatever they're making, wheat, whatever they're making it of. And it's the same with some bourbons and same with some other drinks. But I would say that your liquors are generally more just liquor. They're more just fermented grains that are turned into alcohol directly from it and then soaked in a barrel.
Yeah.
That includes your wines, which come from grapes generally, but your wines and also your bourbons and your harder liquors. And so Just moderation is the key there. If you have one glass of wine, red wine per evening with your meal, that's not going to kill you. In fact, it's probably good for you, according to a lot of doctors and according to a lot of resources out there. But I think the key is there. Again, we just talk about moderation here.
Okay, yeah. So alcohol is something that we need to look at as well. I think sometimes people willingly or unwittingly kind of skip over alcohol. Like they'll do the Whole30 and really clean up their diet from a food perspective.
Sure.
But the alcohol might not change, but that's a big one too.
Yeah,
and it has a lot of calories in it too.
Yeah,
we're not talking about calories right now, but that does have a lot of calories.
A lot
too.
of empty calories.
Okay, all right. So we've got diet. What else? What are some of the other things we should be concerned about?
Let's talk about how you train. So programming and how you train. I like, and the way that we program for our client base, the way that I recommend my patients train too in their fitness program is an undulating progressional model, meaning basically that their programming rises and falls when it comes to loads. Okay. Now, I don't recommend that for the novice, and I don't recommend that for the early trainee because we're building a base. But once the base and foundation has been built, I do believe for more mature trainees, people like you, people like me, that have been training for quite a while.
Yeah.
I don't continue to lift heavy, and that's all I ever do.
Right.
I will have weeks where I lighten my loads a little bit. I focus on form. I focus on a little bit more volume. And I do recognize that I'm going to lose some top tier strength during that timeline. That I don't see that as a detractor to that. I can still squat 3 wheels all day long for reps.
Yeah.
I mean, how much stronger do I need to be as a 200-pound male?
Right.
So, when you put it into big perspective, you're going to lose some top tier strength during that time. But I think one of the important principles to joint health long-term is learning when to hold them, learning when to fold them.
Yeah.
You learn when to give, learn when to take, learn when to back your training off for a while. And during that time, I also like to introduce some high-intensity interval training and some generally good movement.
Right.
Which would be things like long hikes or maybe slower run in there. Which, by the way, running has not been shown to be bad for the knees. It's, again, overdoing everything that causes joint health problems.
Yeah.
And so I like to introduce other modes and mediums of training in there while we're doing some lighter lifting that's a little bit more volume oriented maybe, and we're taking some of the stress off those joints in regards to having a lot of heavy loads for long periods of time. So there's this ebb and flow, and it's important to recognize that is different for each and every individual.
Yeah. There's a lot.
There's not one recipe. It matters, like we always say on the podcast. It matters.
That's right. And to your earlier point, how since we're mostly training masters lifters here at the gym and online, it matters what kind of history they have when they come to us.
Yes. What's their baseline health to start with?
If their joint health is already trash when we're starting out. Then we're going to be going into that undulating sort of model quicker.
Yeah.
And we're going to spend less time with that heavy loading throughout the year than with somebody who's got more robust joint health.
Well, and I find, like I said earlier, the majority of the time, the thing that limits training progression in our trainees and in my patients too is their joint health.
Yeah.
It's just their joints hurt. Their knees hurt, their hips hurt, their shoulders hurt, those load-bearing joints where you handle loads through the joints, they hurt eventually because there's wear and tear on them. Now, I know people that are in their 50s and 60s and have never had joint pain. Man, more power to you. That is not me.
Great. Yeah. Probably not the norm.
And I know if there's someone who tells you, I did this program and I have not had joint pain ever again. That is bull. They are selling you something. It's just not human.
Yeah.
That's not a human response to living. People do have every now and then some aches and pains, and some of them are very associated with the aging process.
Yeah.
Our goal is to minimize those things, but also train people into how to manage any training symptoms that they might be having so that they can maintain a high fitness and activity level and quality of life and still be able to have good joint health.
Yeah. No.
So So it's a balance. It's a balance.
Now, I'm curious here because we've got there's a big spectrum. There's a long way away from heavy squats, like heavy triples or doubles or something, like really heavy squats, and a long hike,
right?
For instance. Now, how do you feel about hypertrophy style training as a way to back off the load, but still introduce stress that's going to drive muscle contractile
that's that volume,
tissue growth?
That's that volume concept.
So what do you think about people that are saying like, yeah, you know what, my joints are getting achy. It's like these heavy squats are bugging my knees. What if I spent some time doing like sets of 10 and 12 leg presses, or maybe like some front squats for some quad growth?
And I even like to
higher
do
reps.
Yeah, I love it. It's not how we build our strength foundation, but I love it in regards to maintaining some muscle belly size and also get good motion in a joint with lighter loads. We just got to keep the volume under control, because volume is kind of what kills
so
older folks
that's
too.
What I'm curious about, right? So generally speaking, one of the big drivers of muscle hypertrophy is the time under tension.
Correct.
And so longer sets and more of them.
And the load percentage. Yeah.
Right. We'll accomplish that. But do we need to be watching out for how many sets we do? Should we focus on maybe less sets, but longer sets, like 8s, 10s, 12s?
Well, and I think you can play with all that stuff. I like the 8 to 12 rep range. I really like the 8 to 10 rep range for hypertrophy work. I hate to say it, I sometimes like an AMRAP set at the end of the training to do that, where you get a lot of fatigue in the muscle, you get a lot of blood. You get a lot of blood shunted to the muscle that blows the muscle belly up and expands the cell wall of the muscle cell wall.
The pump.
The pump, exactly. I also like doing supersets every now and then. I like giant sets sometimes, where you might take 2 or 3 different. You take one prime exercise and then you'll take 2 assistive exercises or accessory exercises and throw those in. I like doing that. So we can be very creative in ways to stimulate muscle growth and hypertrophy and still limit the loads on joint. Now, the reason why the loads are limited on joints when you're doing some of these activities is because they're usually not big compound movements. They're not always big compound movements. So you just naturally can't handle as much weight.
Right.
They're more isolated movements, like bicep curl.
Yeah.
And so that's one concept. And so, but principle number 2, first principle is diet, good quality diet. Principle number 2, and along with diet, let's just also talk about, let's throw in there, so we don't forget, good sleeping habits, good resting habits, those types of things too, getting away from stress. So I'll throw that up in there with diet, even though that's a conversation in and of itself. But
which by
we
the
don't
way,
have time for that today.
Yeah. And I'll just say this as an aside there, when you're talking about sleep and recovery, both of these things have a big effect. I think people discount that sometimes. Like if you're eating a lot of crappy food all the time, you're probably not going to sleep very well.
Right.
If you're hammering yourself over and over and over in the gym, you're probably not going to sleep very well.
Right.
So anyway, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, put you in a stress load and you overtrain. And so number 1 was diet. Number 2 is undulating or rising and falling your training in kind of a load model that allows your joints to have less load over them in certain cycles of your training.
Yeah.
That's another principle that I like to use here. The last thing is listening to yourself and listening to your trainee. If you're a coach, listening to your trainee. If you're a lifter and you're a client and you're a trainee, listening to yourself. Now, that doesn't mean I want you to use RPE or something like that, or that I want you to listen to how you feel about it. I feel like I can't train today.
Feels, man.
I'm going to listen to my feels. I'm going to touch my feels
tell me
today.
that I need to curl in the squat rack today.
Yes, exactly. But I do think it's important that lifters and coaches develop a sense of self-awareness to where you know the difference between just normal training adaptations, soreness and discomfort. Because I've trained on some occasions, I'm so crazy sore I couldn't even walk. When I was doing CrossFit and some stuff like that, and I was doing a lot of high intensity interval training, which I like, by the way, on some of that low load cycling. I like some HIIT in there, some conditioning in there to just get good motion as Lotion type activity. But man, I'd be so sore I couldn't even walk, man. But it was mostly muscular soreness. Every now and then it'd be connective tissue soreness, and that's not as good, but can be dealt with. But there's a difference between joint pain and muscular pain. Joint pain is usually centered around the joint, like it's around your knee joint. It's achy, it's deep, it's boring. It usually gets better with training, and it gets worse after training, and you develop stiffness associated with it too.
Yeah.
Some of that can be connective tissue problems too, but you develop stiffness, but it's actually discomfort down in the joint, and it's harder to isolate.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
when you have
Kinda
quad soreness, it's in
diffused.
your quads.
Yeah.
When you have knee soreness, it's inside your knee due to the lining of your knee being inflamed, or having maybe some inflamed cartilage or some joint cartilage that's irritated. That's actually down inside the joint. It's going to be more localized to that joint structure.
Yeah, it's interesting having gone through patellar, tendonitis.
Yeah,
That's a certain feeling. It's almost like your knees feel kind of weak. There's that dull ache that follows you around all day, but it's kind of like they feel a little weak.
I tell people that weakness is a painful inhibition.
Yeah.
It's a painful inhibition. You have discomfort in the joint. Your body says don't produce as much effort in the muscle bellies that surround that joint, and the joint naturally feels less stable.
Right.
It feels less able.
Yeah, it feels like they could buckle in any moment.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
then the joint pain in the knee is it's deeper, more dull, and just kind of like it almost feels like just fatigue to me.
Yeah, it's boring.
Yeah.
Aching. I mean, if you've ever met someone that's had a total knee replacement or total hip replacement, and they've had bad arthritic joint pain prior to their replacement, they have a replacement, and I mean within a week they love the fact that they had a replacement. Not all people. Some people, they just can't tolerate pain, but they're like, yeah, I'm sore from surgery and being cut on and being hacked on, and having part of my bone cut off, sawed off, and putting a new surface on, but this is so much better than the boring, aching, arthritic pain I had.
Yeah.
Arthritic pain generally, and arthritis basically it's Latin. Arth means joint and itis means inflammation. Arthritis basically just means an inflamed joint. You can have that as a young person. There's a difference between arthritis, traumatic arthritis, and osteoarthritis, or arthritis that's associated with age. Mm-hmm. And so, but generally speaking, arthritis, when you wake up in the morning, your joints will be stiff and maybe a little sore, but mostly stiffness. After you get going during your day, it improves. And I'm talking about the knees as an example. And as you go out throughout the evening and you've been on your feet more, it gets a little worse. It gets a little worse, and then you start to ache a little bit more. And then when you get off your feet in the evening, you might have some residual aching that just kind of continues. Sometimes it can disrupt sleep. And then in the morning, you're kind of back to the same cycle again. And there are intensifying periods of that symptom progression, and lowering periods of that symptom progression too, and how your body feels those symptoms over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say that, generally speaking, that the more range of motion the joint has, the more likely we are to experience that joint pain?
I wouldn't say that. I would say this: the more loading capacity a joint has, the more we're likely to use it to load it, and in some cases abuse it. But there are a lot of joints that have less loading capacity, but they have a high repetition of use, a high frequency of use, and sometimes they get worn out too.
Yeah, I think, because I think about like the knees versus the ankles, right?
Yeah.
Like knee pain, I think, is much more common than ankle pain.
Yeah.
Right. Ankle doesn't really articulate very much.
Well,
fairly limited range of motion in comparison.
It is. It's much more conjoined, meaning that it has a lot fewer degrees of freedom than a knee does. Now, a knee is a hinge joint, an ankle's a saddle joint, but a knee's a hinge joint, so it functions differently.
Yeah.
But the ankle has multiple joints within it, so it has multiple articulations. The knee has a handful of articulations. It's a lot less complicated than the ankle is too. But generally speaking, our feet are flat on the ground when we're doing things, and the ankle does shift and move and bend and twist as we walk on unlevel surfaces. But yeah, I think any joints that are loaded generally have a problem with being overused than those that are not loaded.
Yeah.
But you can take, what's the primary loading joint in the hand? It's the thumb.
Yeah.
I mean, the thumb is the big user in the hand. It's the thing that we use. And so sometimes patients will get arthritis at what we call the first MCP joint, which is the joint up in the thumb, and then also in the carpometacarpal joint, which is down at the base of the thumb at the wrist.
Yeah.
And so that's a very common area for arthritic changes because the thumb is used for gripping and for functioning, when we grip and carry heavy loads or do things like that. So, So first principle, have a solid diet. Get lots of sleep. Get lots of rest. Stay away from inflammatory foods. Second principle, make your programming to where it undulates, where there's a cyclical rise and fall to how you load your joints over time. Give your body microcycles, that fit into the macro cycle of your fitness program, where you have periods of lower loads and maybe do some hypertrophy training or some high intensity interval training. And you can still do once, twice a week, some compound lifts in that. And you can still lift some heavier loads, but you just want to back off some of the tonnage in doing that. And you can also reach out to us to get some practical tips for you personally as a lifter, as a member of the 40 Fit Nation. And then the last thing would be self-aware. Know when you are feeling joint pain versus just normal training adaptation. I'll just tell you this. Some trainees over the years that I've trained, they have no clue. Every little ache or pain that they have turns out to be something that needs to be treated.
Yeah.
And that's not true. If I treated every ache and pain I have every day, I would live in a practitioner's office somewhere. Yeah. I'd just camp out there.
Yeah.
I'd get a cot, then I'd lay that freaking thing down, and I'd get a little mini fridge.
Sleep with a bottle of Bengay.
I'd just live there, Yeah. So develop some self-awareness and listen to your coach and get a good medical practitioner that can help you there too to create a balance. As to get a medical practitioner that actually has a high fitness level or that actually enjoys fitness and actually does something, lives that lifestyle. But those are the three big things that I recommend to improve that joint health. And when needed, seek medical attention. When your joint is just crazy trashy, there are some other options that we talked about in a prior podcast, regenerative medicine, some other things that you can do, joint injections.
Go see Dr. Clearfield.
Yep. There's other things that you can do as Motion is Medicine, his practice here in Texas, North Texas area, North Richland Hills. So you could do that too. But those are the big three. So, man, I think we need to wrap this thing up. I said there's going to be a short podcast, and I think there's about 40-minute.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, this is important stuff.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Well, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining 40 Fit Radio, and thanks for being part of the 40 Fit Nation. We recently set out a kind of a newsletter about holiday eating that went out to anyone that's on our email distribution list. You can go to @40fit.com. You can go to 40fit.com. You can sign up for our newsletter there. And if you don't get that, then you can just email us info@40fit.com and we'll send that to you directly.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's just kind of a healthy eating holiday recommended tips and guidelines for this Thanksgiving season. And it also could apply to Christmas season too, or any holiday season.
Yeah. The main takeaway there is that, because you're going to be listening to this after Thanksgiving, but the main takeaway is Thanksgiving is a holiday. It's not a season.
Yeah, exactly.
We can say the same thing. I'm sorry, guys, but Christmas is a holiday, not a season.
Yeah, exactly.
At least when it comes to your diet. So, you can enjoy all the fudge and the candies and the pies, but let's not make it a 6-week affair.
Yeah.
And then be like, well, we'll pick up the pieces in January.
Yep, that's right. So, thanks for joining us today, man. Check us out on Instagram @40FitRadio. Trent is @Marmalade Cream. I'm @Dr. Deaton. We're signing out today and hope you have some good joint health. Take care.